stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and...
There was no racism in the United States. There was no racism. There was none. Now they've recreated racism. What do you think it's going to do for race relations when they make me pay you for reparations? What do you think that's going to do for race relations, officer? Do you think it's going to help? Do you think it's going to make white people like black people?
It's kind of not the point, making white people like black people, but we'll talk about that in a minute. While Wednesday's attack on Capitol Hill was an unprecedented sight for almost all Americans, the motive behind the siege has actually been seen before in history. In 1861, an angry mob of Southerners attempted to storm the Capitol to prevent the counting of electoral votes for Abraham Lincoln. As recounted in the New York Times, a key difference between the two attacks was the guarding of the United States Capitol by General Winfield Scott, who prevented an angry mob from entering the building's hallowed halls. Inside the Capitol that day, pro-Southern politicians railed against Lincoln's victory, similarly to what we saw on Wednesday, one congressman even accusing the 16th president of tyranny on the House floor. 3 weeks later, Lincoln made his inaugural address in front of the Capitol Dome, which was still being built, in which he said, quote, "The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." The American Civil War began shortly thereafter. That historic scene was much different than what we saw at the Capitol this past week. Windows shattered, doors broken, an angry mob of Trump supporters trying to assume control of the country's greatest symbol of democracy. The riot also reminds us of last summer in D.C.'s Lafayette Park, when mostly peaceful individuals protesting in the wake of George Floyd's murder were met by heavily armed police officers with tear gas and smoke bombs. All that force used not to quell a violent insurrection 4 days ago, but to clear people striving for a better, more fair, more just America who were inconveniently standing in the way of Donald Trump's photo op with the Bible held upside down in front of a church. The contrast between the two events is actually stark. On Wednesday, some Capitol police officers even moved out of the way for protesters to get inside the building, while others reportedly gave directions to the angry mob on where they could find certain members of Congress. 316 protesters were arrested around Lafayette Park that day last summer. 316. How many were taken into custody in the last 4 days? 61 so far. I'm joined now by Nicole Hannah-Jones, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the New York Times Magazine, creator of the renowned 1619 Project, and Jelani Cobb, staff writer at The New Yorker. Good morning to both of you. Nicole, I sort of can't say it better than Joy Reid said it. The lack of fear in the people who were threatening the police and imposing violence on them. I was in the streets, as you know, in Minneapolis after the death of George Floyd. It wasn't like that. People were not able to go up to cops in their faces and threaten them without fear of consequences, certainly not black people. This insurrection is nothing like the Black Lives Matter movement.
No, it's not. And what it really goes to is who are considered legitimate citizens who can legitimately protest their government and who are not. And we know that the history of this is very long. We can go back to Dred Scott in 1857 when the Supreme Court ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, could never be citizens of this country because they belong to a slave race. So when you take that and then you understand the roots of law enforcement, particularly in the South and in certain parts of the Northeast, came from the slave patrols. So the design was to serve white Americans and to control black Americans. Then what we see happening in the treatment of protesters is very predictable. Black protest is considered illegitimate, even though black protesters were literally saying, we want the rule of law. We are protesting so that we can be treated the same before the law, versus these protesters who have had every access to the courts. We know Donald Trump tried his case in dozens of courts. He lost the election, and they don't want the rule of law. That's actually not what they're looking for. They're trying to overturn the law, and yet are being treated with the utmost respect that law enforcement treats people whom it considers to be full citizens.
And Jelani, it's interesting because when you think about big marches and you think about Black Lives Matter, fighting for justice, right? People wanted the same justice that other Americans get. Or you're fighting against a war that you think is unjust. Or you're fighting for, the protection of the climate. Or you're fighting for gun control. You're fighting for something, some kind of change. These folks in Washington on Wednesday were fighting against democracy. There was a democratic thing that was going on, and they were trying to prevent it. It deserves a particular type of scorn.
Sure, it does. But the other side of it is, if we're going to be brutally honest about American history, that vantage point has won out more often than it has not. If you look at the elections between 1876 and 1965, none of those elections were legitimate. If you're counting the entire populace being able to vote, and we're only counting people after the 14th Amendment said that we were citizens. We're not even going to count the elections prior when that question was up in the air. But from the point at which the U.S. Constitution said that black people were citizens of the United States, it wasn't until well into 2/3 of the 20th century had elapsed before we actually began having what could be considered legitimate elections. And so they are simply trying to recall a period of American history which isn't that distant, which is not that far from where we are right now. Now, the other thing I'll say about this is that we should be very concerned that this movement will go on January 20th from seeing the inauguration of the president, the incoming president, Joe Biden, to becoming a movement to restore Donald Trump. From preventing the inauguration to restoring Donald Trump. I think that will be the next rallying cry that we will see organized violence around.
Nicole, you tweeted on January 9th, what has always appalled me about this country is how we have so much more empathy for powerful people who commit crimes out of greed than for poor people who commit crimes out of desperation. Tell me a little more about that.